Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. It started with something small. That's how these things usually begin, right? You don't immediately jump to conclusions. You notice something off, you shake it off, tell yourself it's probably nothing. That's what I did. Karen had been distant for weeks, maybe months. It wasn't obvious at first, but there were little things. She was coming home later, spending more time at work. Normally she'd talk to me about her day, small things, something about a coworker, a weird conversation she had at the grocery store, whatever. But recently, nothing. The silence felt thick, and she wasn't just quiet. She was somewhere else, her mind far away, like I wasn't even in the room. But I kept pushing those thoughts away. We've been married for 15 years. People get busy, right? Things get routine, it happens. I told myself that was all it was. It was a Saturday when I saw it, the first real crack in the facade. I was sitting on the couch, half watching a football game I didn't care about, trying to relax after a long week. Karen was in the kitchen, clearing the dishes from dinner. We didn't say much, just the usual polite chatter. Everything felt normal enough. But then her phone buzzed. She was across the room, so I glanced over at it on the counter, like I always did. But this time something was different. The name on the screen wasn't one I recognized. Brad. Now, I'm not the jealous type. We've both got friends of the opposite sex. That's never been an issue, but this was the first time I'd ever seen the name Brad, and I'm a guy who notices those kinds of things. It's in my nature. Maybe being a software engineer made me more attentive to patterns, to when things didn't quite fit. Karen came back into the room, phone in hand, quickly tapping something out. She didn't mention the text, didn't say who it was, and just like that, I felt it, a flicker of suspicion. Nothing more than a seed, really, but enough to plant itself in my gut. I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to start interrogating her over a text message, but it didn't sit right with me. That night, she went to bed early, saying she was exhausted. I pretended to stay up watching TV, but I was hardly paying attention. My mind kept going back to that text. Who was Brad? A friend from work? Someone I didn't know about? Or something else? I tried to shake it off, but the more I thought about it, the more that little seed of suspicion started growing roots. By the time I went to bed, I was making a plan. The next day, I took a step I never thought I'd take. I knew it was wrong, but something in me had already clicked. I had to know. So I did what any tech-savvy guy would do. I set up a tracker on her phone. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small GPS app that would send me her location history. Simple, discreet, undetectable. She'd never know. A part of me hated that I was doing it. This wasn't how our marriage was supposed to be. But I had to find out. I had to know if I was being paranoid or if there was something more going on. The first couple of days, everything seemed fine. Her schedule didn't raise any red flags. She went to work, hit the gym like she said she would, came home on time. I almost started to relax. Almost. But then things changed. She began coming home later again, texting more frequently, disappearing into her office to handle emails more than usual. And her location history? There were gaps. Whole hours when she was in places that didn't match her usual routine. A parking lot on the other side of town. A restaurant we'd never been to. A hotel. My stomach dropped. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed more proof. So I kept quiet, watching and waiting, gathering more evidence. 2 weeks later, it all came crashing down. It was a Wednesday night. Karen had come home late again, brushing off my questions with some vague excuse about work. I tried to act normal, to not let her see the tension I was feeling, but inside I was boiling over. Something had changed in her, and I wasn't imagining it anymore. I was in the kitchen, pretending to make myself a late-night snack when I heard her phone buzz again. Another text. I was standing close enough this time to catch a glimpse of it before she picked it up. Brad, can't wait for Friday. Same place? That was it. The confirmation I needed. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, but I didn't say a word. Not yet. I watched as she smiled down at the screen, typing back quickly, her expression completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing just feet away. I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked into the living room trying to control the fury that was building inside me. I sat down, took a breath, and called out to her. "Hey, Karen?" She walked in, her phone still in hand. "Yeah? Where were you tonight?" It was a simple question. A casual question, but I watched her closely, waiting to see how she'd respond. Her eyes flicked up, startled, and for the briefest second, I saw something in her expression that confirmed everything I feared. It was there and gone in an instant, but it was enough. She recovered quickly, offering the same empty excuse as before. "I told you I had a late meeting." I nodded slowly, letting the lie hang between us for a moment. Then I asked her the question I'd been dreading for weeks. "Who's Brad?" Her face paled, and for a second I thought she might actually tell the truth. But instead, she straightened, her eyes hardening, her lips curling into a smirk I didn't recognize. "Brad?" she said, almost laughing. "Oh, you mean Brad. Let's just say he's more of a man than you'll ever be." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. More of a man? My mind raced, replaying every conversation, every cold look, every unexplained absence. It all clicked into place. And then she laughed, the host. Actually laughed, like it was all some kind of joke. "David, seriously, don't act so surprised. You had to know. You're not him. Brad knows how to treat a woman. He can give me what I need." My throat tightened. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Not yet." Instead, I just nodded. "Right, Brad." Karen rolled her eyes, clearly done with the conversation. "Look, you don't need to make this a big thing. I'm going away this weekend, all right? We'll talk about it later." She turned, walking out of the room without a second glance. I sat there staring at the spot where she'd been standing, my mind racing. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head, but one stood out above the rest. This isn't over. I wasn't the kind of guy who just sat back and let life happen to him. I wasn't going to wallow in self-pity or beg her to stay. No, this was war now. She had crossed a line, and I was going to make sure she regretted it. Karen thought she was in control, but she had no idea what was coming. As she packed her bags that weekend, heading off to meet Brad, I was already making my own plans. It was time to take back what was mine. I didn't waste any time after she left that weekend. Once the door closed behind her, my mind clicked into gear. There was no need to dwell on what she said, no point in playing the victim. She made it clear where she stood. Brad was the real man, the one who could give her what she needed, what I apparently couldn't. Fine, let her have her weekend. I had plans of my own. First, I needed more information. I needed to be sure about everything, to confirm what I already suspected. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still some gaps. So I doubled down on the tracker I had installed on her phone. This time I'd go deeper, using a program that not only showed her location, but also gave me access to her messages, her calls, anything I needed to keep tabs on her. It wasn't difficult. She'd never been all that tech savvy, and I'd always been the one to handle the tech in the house. Within an hour, I had access to everything. I sat down at my computer, pulling up her texts, and there they were. Dozens of messages between her and Brad, all confirming what I already knew, but still sending a wave of nausea through me. "Brad, Friday can't come soon enough. I've been thinking about you all day." Karen, "Same here, babe. You always know how to make me feel special." Special, right. The bile rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about strategy. I wasn't going to confront her, at least not yet. I had to be smart, precise. Karen didn't know it, but the moment she started playing this game, she'd already lost. The messages gave me everything I needed. times, places, even little details about their plans. I learned that they were staying at some fancy hotel across town, the kind of place she would never have suggested we go to. It made sense. Karen always craved that lifestyle, the one I hadn't been able to provide. But now, as she was off living her fantasy, I was preparing to dismantle it all. As I scrolled through the texts, something caught my eye, a mention of a trip they had planned for next month, a weekend getaway to the Bahamas. That little tidbit solidified everything for me. This wasn't just a fling. She was planning her life with him, one where I no longer existed except as a footnote, the poor sap she left behind. It made me wonder if she had any idea how far I was willing to go to tear her world apart. But that was for later. Right now, I had to focus on what I could control. I started with the money. Karen had no idea how much control I had over our finances. She always let me handle the bills, the savings, the investments. She trusted me with that, probably because she never cared to understand how it all worked. Now that blind trust was going to be her undoing. It started small. I moved money from our joint account into one of my personal accounts, something I'd set up years ago but never needed to use. Just a few thousand at first, nothing that would raise alarms. Then I began liquidating some of our other assets, selling off stocks, pulling money from our investment accounts, transferring everything I could under the radar. By the time the weekend was over, I had funneled almost all of our liquid assets into accounts she couldn't touch. She wouldn't know until it was too late. I smiled at the thought. Next was the credit cards. I logged into our account and canceled the joint cards, leaving her with nothing but her personal card. She could max that out for all I cared. It wouldn't make a dent in what I was planning. I left just enough for her to think everything was fine for the weekend. By the time she got back, though, she'd find herself with no access to the life she'd built on my back. While she was with Brad, probably lying in some hotel bed, I started working on the other pieces of the puzzle. I took a look around our house, scanning every room for the things she valued most. It wasn't difficult. Karen had always been transparent about the things that made her feel special. Jewelry, clothes, her expensive bags, all status symbols that she thought made her better than everyone else. I decided those were the first things to go. It was almost too easy. I knew where she kept her valuables, her jewelry boxes, her designer handbags tucked neatly into the closet. I gathered everything, taking my time, making sure I didn't miss a single item that she cared about. Every piece of her carefully curated life went into boxes, and within hours, I had it all packed and ready for sale. The next day, I made a few calls. I knew a couple of places in town that bought high-end items with no questions asked. A quick sale, some cash in hand, and Karen's prized possessions were as good as gone. Watching her face when she realized everything she had collected over the years was missing, that would be worth more than anything I could ever sell. But it didn't stop there. As I worked through the weekend, the plan continued to evolve. It wasn't enough to just take her money and her things. I needed to make sure she had nothing to fall back on. That's when I remembered the car. She loved that car, an expensive, flashy SUV that made her feel like she was above the rest of us. It was the perfect target. I called the bank and arranged to have it repossessed. There were still a few payments left, and I made sure to cancel those as well. By the time she got home, the car would be gone, just another reminder of what she had lost. With every move I made, I felt a sense of control, of power. Karen thought she was the one in charge, but she had no idea that I was stripping everything away piece by piece. When Sunday finally rolled around, I was ready. I sat in the living room, calm and composed, waiting for her to return. I had done everything I needed to do, and now it was just a matter of time. The house was eerily quiet without her things cluttering it up, without the constant hum of tension that had filled our lives for the past few months. I felt a strange sense of peace. Around 6 p.m., the front door opened, and Karen walked in, suitcase in hand. She looked tired but happy, her face flushed with the glow of a weekend well spent. She dropped her bags by the door and glanced around the room, her brow furrowing slightly. "David?" she called out, her voice uncertain. I stood up, keeping my expression neutral as I walked into the hallway. Welcome back. She looked at me, clearly expecting something more. Maybe an argument, maybe a confrontation, but I wasn't giving her that. Not yet. Where's the car? She asked, her voice sharper now, her eyes scanning the driveway through the window. I shrugged. Gone. Gone? What do you mean, gone? I mean, it's gone, repossessed. Her face paled, and for a moment she looked like she didn't know how to respond. What? How? Why? I let the silence hang between us, watching as her mind raced, trying to catch up. She glanced around the room again, and I could see the gears turning. Something wasn't right, and she knew it. Then she saw the empty shelves, the missing paintings from the walls. Her face went white as she spun around, taking in the house that no longer looked like hers. Where's my stuff? Her voice was rising now, a mix of panic and disbelief. Sold, I said, my tone flat. All of it. Karen stood there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to process the words. What? You sold my things? You can't. I can, and I did. Her face twisted with fury, but there was something else there too, fear. Realization was starting to sink in. She had no idea what I'd done, how deep this went. What the hell, David? She snapped, her voice shaking. You had no right. I had every right, I replied, my voice calm, controlled. You walked out on this marriage the second you decided Brad was the real man. So now I'm taking back what's mine. Her eyes darted around the room again, as if she was searching for something, anything that hadn't been touched. But there was nothing. Everything she had worked so hard to accumulate, all the symbols of her success were gone. And that was just the beginning. You don't get it, do you? I continued, stepping closer to her. You thought you could just waltz out of here, spend your weekends with him, and I just sit here and take it? Well, guess what, Karen? I'm done sitting back. I'm done playing the fool. She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. Check your accounts. Go ahead. Her hand shook as she pulled out her phone, furiously tapping at the screen. I watched as her face crumbled, her expression shifting from anger to disbelief to pure, unadulterated panic. What the hell did you do? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I took everything, I said simply. The money, the assets, the credit cards, it's all gone. You've got nothing left. Karen's hands were trembling as she lowered her phone, staring at me like she didn't even recognize me. You can't do this. I already did. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood there, her world crashing down around her, and there was nothing she could do about it. I watched her, waiting for the inevitable breakdown, the moment when she'd realized just how badly she had screwed up. But instead, she did something I hadn't expected. She laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound, one that sent a chill down my spine. You think this is over? She asked, her voice cold, calculated. You think you've won? I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She could see it in my eyes. This wasn't about winning. It was about taking back control. Her laugh faded, replaced by a cold, hard stare. You've made a mistake, David. A big one. Maybe I had, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Karen stood there for a few moments longer, her fists clenched at her sides, her face a mask of anger and disbelief. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. As I stood there in the silence, the reality of what I'd done began to sink in, but there was no regret, no second guessing. For the first time in months, I felt free. I stood there watching the door she slammed behind her. The house felt eerily quiet, almost too still, like the air had been sucked out of it. I'd expected a fight, a real one, but that laugh? The chill it sent down my spine lingered longer than it should have. Karen wasn't someone who just gave up, and her laugh made it clear she wasn't done. But neither was I. I wasn't interested in playing mind games. I didn't need her fear or her fury. All I needed was to finish what I started. The house was nearly stripped clean. The bank accounts drained. I had set up my moves with precision, each one executed without hesitation. But there was one last piece that still needed to be put in place. Her professional life. Karen thrived on status. Losing her material possessions would hurt, sure, but taking away her reputation? That would crush her. It was time to go for the jugular. I spent the next hour carefully gathering everything I had on her. I already had the texts, the photos, and a treasure trove of incriminating evidence from the tracker I'd installed. But I wanted more. I needed to dig a little deeper. So I hacked into her work email. It wasn't difficult, really. She'd always been careless with passwords. Her favorite pet's name and our anniversary date? Amateur hour. Within minutes, I was inside her work account scanning through her emails. And there it was, dozens of exchanges with Brad, some of them sent during work hours, others referencing their hotel meetups during supposed business trips. There were even a few emails to colleagues where she lied about her whereabouts, asking them to cover for her while she met up with him. I had everything I needed. I crafted a quick, concise email. No anger, no melodrama, just the facts. I attached the incriminating evidence and addressed it to her boss, the head of HR, and a few key colleagues she relied on at work. I hit send. She wouldn't know it yet, but by tomorrow morning, her professional world would implode. The woman who had mocked me for not being man enough to give her the life she craved was about to find herself without a job, without status, without a single thread of the life she had built for herself. The irony was delicious. As I sat back, watching the email disappear into cyberspace, I felt a strange sense of calm. I'd been expecting this moment to feel triumphant, like a wave of victory washing over me. But instead, it just felt quiet. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't even smiling. I was just done. Karen thought she was in control. She thought she could laugh in my face and walk out of our life without consequence. But she had no idea the extent of the damage I was willing to inflict. And now it was too late for her to stop it. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No text from Karen, no knocks at the door, nothing. The house felt empty, almost lifeless, without her chaos to fill the space. I made myself coffee, half expecting her to show up at some point, to scream and demand answers. But she didn't. Instead, my phone buzzed with a message. It wasn't Karen, it was a mutual friend of ours. The text was brief, a single line that told me everything I needed to know. Karen's been fired. I didn't need to ask for details. I knew exactly how it had gone down. The fallout from the emails, the shocked looks on her colleagues' faces as they realized what she had been doing, the sudden humiliation as her double life unraveled in front of them. I could picture it all too clearly. She would have tried to explain, to rationalize it away, but there was no coming back from this. Not with the evidence I had sent. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, feeling a sense of finality that I hadn't expected. She was falling, and this was just the beginning. The hours ticked by, and still, there was no word from her. Part of me wondered where she had gone, what she was planning, but I didn't dwell on it. It didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. I had dismantled every part of her life, leaving nothing behind. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. I didn't recognize the number, but I had a feeling it was her. I picked up. "David," her voice crackled through the line. She sounded strained, like she had been crying, but there was an edge to her tone that wasn't entirely broken. "What the hell did you do?" "I think you know what I did, Karen." She was silent for a moment, and I could hear her trying to steady her breath. "You've ruined everything." "No," I said, my voice calm. "You did that. I just made sure everyone else saw it." "You can't just," she started, but I cut her off. "I can, and I did. You brought this on yourself, Karen. You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences. Don't act surprised." There was another pause, longer this time, and I could hear her struggling to hold back whatever anger or desperation was bubbling inside her. "Brad's gone," she said finally, her voice a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. I wasn't surprised. Of course Brad was gone. He was in it for the thrill, for the affair. But now that Karen was financially ruined, professionally disgraced, and a liability, he'd drop her like the dead weight she had become. Men like him didn't stick around when the fantasy was shattered by reality. Good for him, I said, keeping my tone steady. I'm sure he's already found someone else to play his games with. I could hear her breath hitch on the other end, the weight of everything crashing down on her at once. She had nothing left. No job, no money, no lover. I had stripped it all away, just like she had stripped away every piece of our marriage when she decided I wasn't enough. What are you going to do now, Karen? I asked, genuinely curious. I don't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know, David. You've taken everything from me. No, I said, leaning forward, my voice soft but firm. You did that. I just made sure you couldn't pretend anymore. I could feel her tears on the other end, even though she wasn't sobbing. She was broken, truly broken, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to pity. But it was fleeting. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. I don't know what to do, she whispered again, this time almost to herself. That's not my problem anymore, I said, my voice resolute. You need to figure it out. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought she might hang up. But instead, she asked one final question, her voice trembling. Do you hate me? I thought about it. Did I hate her? After everything she had done, after the lies, the betrayal, the cruelty, did I hate her? No, I said finally, surprising myself with the answer. I don't hate you, Karen, but I can't ever forgive you. The silence on the other end was heavy, and then, without another word, the line went dead. I set the phone down, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. It was done. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. Karen was gone, really gone this time, and I was left with nothing but the quiet. For the first time in months, I felt free. The next few days passed in a blur. Karen didn't call again, and I didn't reach out. I had heard from a few friends that she was staying with a relative, trying to piece together whatever was left of her life. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I had taken everything from her, and she was on her own now. I started packing up the rest of the house, preparing to sell it. There was no reason to stay here anymore, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer existed. I needed a fresh start, somewhere new, somewhere far away from the wreckage Karen had left behind. As I packed, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the revenge, the fallout. It had all played out so perfectly, like a carefully executed plan, and yet there was no joy in it, no sense of victory, just a quiet, steady resolve. I had done what needed to be done. I had taken back control. But the emptiness that lingered afterward was something I hadn't anticipated. Karen had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. Not really. The consequences of what we had done, what we had both done, would follow us for the rest of our lives. But I wasn't going to let what defined me. Not anymore. The day I signed the papers to sell the house, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had closed the door on that chapter of my life, and now it was time to move on. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done living in the past. As I handed over the keys to the real estate agent, I glanced back at the house one last time. It was just a building now, an empty shell of the life I had once shared with Karen. I felt no attachment to it anymore. It was just a place like any other. I turned and walked away, leaving it all behind. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Karen or Brad or revenge. I was thinking about the future, my future, and for the first time, it felt like mine again. When I woke up the morning after the house was sold, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. It was strange. After months of case and carefully calculated moves, I didn't have to scheme anymore. The house was gone. Karen was gone. Brad? Probably off chasing someone else's wife by now. I didn't care. My plan had been executed to perfection. There was no unfinished business, no lingering doubts about what came next. For the first time in a long time, I had nothing pressing on my mind, and that was both liberating and unsettling. But I wasn't naive enough to think Karen would just disappear. She'd been humiliated, stripped of everything she valued, and people like her don't just slink away quietly. I knew she'd try something, whether it was coming after me, trying to claw back some of what she'd lost, or just lashing out in desperation. That laugh of hers, the one that still echoed in my mind, told me she wasn't done. And that's why I wasn't done either. My guard couldn't drop, not yet. There were still a few more pieces to fall into place. I'd planned meticulously, and everything had gone off without a hitch so far. The final step? Making sure Karen had no lifeline to grab onto. It was time to cut her off from the last bit of support she had, her family and friends. I couldn't just leave it at financial ruin. No, she needed to experience complete isolation. She had burned me, humiliated me, and it was only fair I returned the favor. The thing is, Karen had always been the darling of her family. They adored her, doted on her, and never saw her for the manipulative woman she truly was. That was about to change. I spent the next hour crafting a careful email. I pulled together every bit of evidence I had on her affair with Brad, texts, photos, the hotel bookings, and even a copy of the email I'd sent to her work that got her fired. I didn't want to leave any room for doubt. Her parents were the key players here. Once they knew, word would spread like wildfire through her social circle, and that support system she had built for herself, it would crumble. I hit send and sat back, letting the weight of what I'd done sink in. This was the last blow. Karen wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The day passed quietly after that. I packed up the rest of my things, keeping my mind busy as I prepared to leave town. I didn't know where I was headed yet, but that didn't matter. What mattered was getting out, starting fresh. I'd already transferred most of the money from the sale of the house into an account Karen couldn't touch. It was mine now, and I was free to go wherever I wanted. Around 4 p.m., my phone was hit. My phone buzzes. It was a text from Karen's sister, Mia. I hesitated for a second before opening it. She and I had never been particularly close, but I had a feeling I knew what this was about. David, I just talked to Mom and Dad. What's going on? I stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to explain everything, lay it all out for her, but I knew that would just lead to more questions, more drama. I wasn't in the mood for that. Instead, I typed out a quick reply. Ask Karen. She'll tell you everything. I tossed the phone aside, not bothering to wait for her response. Let Karen explain herself. Let her squirm as she tried to justify her actions. I wasn't going to play the role of mediator between her and her family. That wasn't my problem anymore. As the sun began to set, I couldn't help but wonder what Karen was doing right now. Was she sitting in some dingy hotel room, staring at her phone in disbelief as the messages from her family started rolling in? Or was she with Brad, desperately trying to salvage whatever scraps of their affair were left? It didn't matter. I'd severed every connection she had, and by now she knew. That night, I went to bed feeling more at peace than I had in months. The plan was done. There were no loose ends, no unfinished business. I could walk away knowing I had taken back control of my life. The next morning, I woke up to a voicemail. Karen, I didn't listen to it right away. I wasn't ready for whatever emotional roller coaster she was about to take me on. But as I poured my coffee, curiosity got the better of me. I hit play and listened. David, her voice came through, shaky but controlled. I don't know what else you want from me. You've taken everything. My money, my family. I get it, okay? You win. But what now? What do you want me to do, David? What's left? I sighed, taking a sip of my coffee as I let her words sink in. What was left? Nothing. That was the point. She continued, her voice cracking. I've got nothing, David, nothing, and I just want to know why. Why did you have to destroy everything? I get that you're hurt, but this is too much. The voicemail ended abruptly, and I stood there in silence, staring out the window at the early morning light. Part of me had expected this, her reaching out, trying to appeal to whatever shred of humanity she thought I had left. But that voicemail, it wasn't about remorse. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was just sorry for what she had lost. And that distinction made all the difference. I didn't call her back. Instead, I spent the rest of the day finalizing my move. I packed up the last of my belongings, closed out my bank accounts, and booked a one-way flight to a city across the country, somewhere new. Somewhere far away from all of this. By the time the evening rolled around, I was ready to go. The house was empty, the movers had taken care of the furniture, and my flight was scheduled for early the next morning. I wasn't leaving behind anything of value, just memories of a life that no longer existed. As I stood in the doorway, looking back at the empty house one last time, my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Karen. I debated ignoring it, but something compelled me to listen. David, she began, her voice quieter this time, almost defeated. I don't know where you are. I don't even know if you're still in town. But I need to see you, please. Just once. I need to understand. I need to know why you hate me so much. Can we talk, please? I deleted the voicemail without responding. There was no point in talking. Karen wanted closure, some kind of explanation that would make her feel better about the mess she had created. But I wasn't going to give her that. She didn't deserve it. The next morning, I boarded the plane without a second thought. As the city disappeared beneath the clouds, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. This was it, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Karen was gone, her life in shambles, and I was finally free. But as the plane soared higher, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. It wasn't regret, exactly. I didn't regret what I had done. But there was a weight, a heaviness, that came with knowing I had dismantled someone's life so completely. I had set out to destroy Karen, and I had succeeded. But now, as I sat there in that airplane seat, I couldn't help but wonder what that said about me. I had spent so much time planning my revenge, so much energy focused on tearing her down, that I hadn't stopped to think about what came after. Sure, I had my freedom, my dignity, but what else? What was I going to do now that the dust had settled? As the plane touched down in my new city, I pushed those thoughts aside. There would be time to figure that out later. For now, I had to focus on rebuilding. My life, my career, everything. The Karen chapter was closed, and I wasn't going to let it define me. I stepped off the plane, breathing in the unfamiliar air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to think about the future. A real future, one that didn't involve her. I didn't know what that future looked like yet, but for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid to find out. I was just starting to settle into my new life when the text came. It was from a number I didn't recognize. It was brief, just a time, a place, and 2 words that stopped me in my tracks. It's Karen. I stared at the screen, my heart beating faster. I thought I'd left all of this behind, buried it with the plane ticket and my fresh start. But here she was, demanding a meeting, dragging me back into the mess I had worked so hard to escape. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and keep moving forward. But the other part, the part that had planned and executed every detail of her downfall, wanted to see how this would play out. One last confrontation. So I replied, fine, I'll be there. The location was a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place we used to go when we were happy before all of this. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I wanted the upper hand. I sat at a table in the corner, my back to the wall, watching the door. My mind was racing, running through all the things she might say, all the ways she might try to twist the situation to make herself the victim. And then she walked in. She looked different. Not in the way you'd expect someone to after having their life torn apart. She wasn't disheveled or broken, at least not on the outside. If anything, she looked composed, even calm. But there was something in her eyes, a desperation she couldn't quite hide, and I knew she wasn't as put together as she wanted to seem. She spotted me immediately and made her way over to the table. I didn't stand up. I didn't even greet her. I just sat there watching her, waiting for her to make the first move. Karen sat down across from me, placing her hands on the table like she was trying to steady herself. She didn't speak right away, just stared at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if she even knew what she wanted to say. But then she took a deep breath and broke the silence. Why? One word, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened between us. It wasn't an angry question. It wasn't accusatory. It was something else, something almost pleading. I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to feel the weight of the question, to sit with it the way I had sat with everything she had done. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest, and finally spoke. Why not? Her eyes widened slightly, like she hadn't expected that response. That's it? She asked, her voice shaking. You ruined my life because... Why not? I shrugged. You ruined mine first. She flinched at that, and for the first time, I saw the crack in her composure. She wasn't as calm as she wanted to seem. I didn't ruin your life, David. I made mistakes, yes, but I never expected you to do this. You didn't expect consequences? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. You thought you could just do whatever you wanted, and I'd sit back and take it? She shook her head, looking down at the table. It wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to hurt you, She stopped herself, biting her lip. Then she looked at me again, her eyes brimming with frustration. I just didn't think you had it in you. That hit harder than it should have, but I didn't let it show. Yeah, I got that impression when you called Brad a real man. Her face tightened at the mention of his name, and for a moment I saw the pain she'd been hiding. Brad wasn't part of her life anymore. That much was obvious. I never meant for it to go this far, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I leaned forward, my gaze locked on hers. But it did, Karen. You took it there. You made your choices, and I made mine. This is where we are now. She didn't respond, just stared at me, the weight of everything pressing down on her. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between the anger she still harbored and the reality she was finally being forced to confront. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her. This wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't even about forgiveness. It was about closure. My closure. She took another deep breath, trying to steady herself. What do you want from me, David? That question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected her to ask that. What did I want? I hadn't really thought about it beyond the revenge, beyond taking back control. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want her back in my life. So what did I want? I want you to understand, I said slowly, carefully choosing my words. I want you to understand what it feels like to have your entire life torn apart by someone you trusted. She blinked, her eyes filling with tears. I do understand, David. You made sure of that. For a brief moment, I felt a twinge of something. Pity, maybe? Regret, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about feeling sorry for her. This was about making her face the consequences of her actions, just like I had. You don't understand, I said, my voice firm. Not yet. You still think you're the victim in all of this. Her tears spilled over, and she wiped them away angrily. How could I not be the victim? You destroyed everything I had. I didn't destroy anything, I said, leaning in closer. You did that the moment you decided to cheat. I just made sure you couldn't lie your way out of it anymore. She stared at me, her chest heaving, as she tried to hold back the sobs that were threatening to break free. But I didn't soften. This was the truth she needed to hear, whether she wanted to or not. You're not a victim, Karen. You're just dealing with the fallout of your own choices. Her face crumpled at that, and for the first time I saw the full extent of her brokenness. She wasn't the confident, arrogant woman who had laughed in my face months ago. She wasn't the woman who had mocked me for not being enough. She was just lost, and that's when it hit me. The confrontation I had been preparing for, the one I had built up in my mind, wasn't going to end with some grand declaration or final blow. It was going to end with this, Karen sitting across from me, shattered, and me realizing that I didn't need anything more from her. I had already won. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. Karen looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, searching my face for something, anything, that would make this moment easier for her. But I wasn't going to give her that. "I don't hate you, Karen," I said quietly, "but I don't forgive you either." She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice, but nothing came out. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face as she looked away. I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her there alone. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to do. The confrontation was over and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just peace. As I stepped into the sunlight, I realized that was all I had ever really wanted. Not revenge, not Karen's destruction, just peace. And now I finally had it. In the weeks after that final meeting with Karen, my life started to settle into something resembling normal. It wasn't the kind of normal I used to know. Married life, comfortable routines, but something new. It was quiet and I learned to appreciate the silence. The chaos that had consumed my every thought for so long was gone. There were no more moves to plan, no more actions to take. I had finished what I set out to do, and for the first time in months, I could just breathe. It was strange, feeling untethered, but I didn't miss the weight that had been pressing down on me. I'd moved to a new city, rented a small apartment overlooking the bay. It wasn't fancy or expensive, just enough to call my own. I spent my mornings running along the water, something I hadn't done in years. It gave me time to think, but I didn't dwell on the past much. I didn't need to. The whole ordeal with Karen had played out exactly the way it needed to, and there was nothing left to pick apart. She hadn't tried to contact me again, which surprised me. After that last conversation, I thought she might try to reach out, to plead her case one more time, but she didn't. Maybe she'd finally accepted the reality of the situation, or maybe she was too ashamed to face me again. Either way, I was glad for the distance. It was time to leave that part of my life behind. One morning, as I was jogging through the park, I found myself thinking about everything that had led me here. It wasn't regret, not exactly, but more of a reflection on the choices I'd made. For so long, I'd been caught up in tearing Karen's life apart, piece by piece. I'd wanted her to feel the pain she'd caused me, to strip her of everything she thought made her better than me. And I'd done it. I'd succeeded. But now that the dust had settled, I realized something I hadn't considered before. Her downfall hadn't fixed anything inside me. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. But I wasn't whole either. The anger I'd felt for so long had burned itself out, and in its place was this quiet emptiness. I didn't feel strong or bitter, just nothing. I stopped running and sat on a bench, watching the sun reflect off the water. Maybe that's what this was all about, I thought. Maybe I'd been chasing closure in the wrong way. I'd been so focused on revenge, on proving a point to Karen, that I'd forgotten to ask myself what came next. I had taken control, sure, but now that I had it, what was I supposed to do with it? I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the photos I'd taken since moving here. Most of them were of the bay, the skyline, random shots of things that had caught my eye on my walks. Simple, peaceful things. It was like I'd been trying to capture this new life in fragments, one picture at a time. For the first time in a while, I let myself think about Karen, not about the anger or the betrayal, but about her as a person. I wondered what she was doing now, how she was coping with the wreckage of her life. Was she still scrambling to pick up the pieces? Had she found a way to move forward the way I had, or was she still stuck, replaying everything over and over in her mind, like a broken record? It didn't matter, not really. Karen wasn't my problem anymore, and I wasn't hers. We'd both made choices, and now we were living with the consequences. Later that evening, as I sat in my apartment, watching the city lights flicker across the water, I realized that this was the closure I'd been searching for all along. It wasn't about what I'd done to Karen or the revenge I'd taken. It was about accepting that life moves forward, even after the worst betrayals. It was about letting go of the past, not because it didn't matter, but because it was over. I didn't hate Karen. I didn't love her either. She was just a part of my story, a chapter that had ended. And now I had the rest of my life to figure out what came next. Over the following weeks, I started to rebuild. Not just my life, but my sense of self. I took on new projects at work, threw myself into coding with a focus I hadn't had in years. I met new people, made a few friends, even started going out for drinks with my colleagues on the weekends. It wasn't the same life I'd had before, but it didn't need to be. This was better. This was mine. Every now and then, I'd think back to that last conversation with Karen, the look in her eyes when she finally understood that I wasn't going to save her, wasn't going to give her the closure she wanted. It wasn't satisfaction I felt when I remembered it, but a kind of peace. I had done what I needed to do to reclaim my dignity, and that was enough. There was one final step in my journey, though, something I hadn't realized I needed until I was ready for it. Forgiveness. Not for Karen, but for myself. I'd spent so much time being angry, feeling like I'd failed somehow by not being man enough for her, that I'd forgotten to forgive myself for believing in her in the first place. Trusting someone isn't a weakness, it's a risk. And sometimes that risk doesn't pay off. But that doesn't mean I was wrong for taking it. It just meant I had to learn from it. In the end, Karen had lost everything that mattered to her. Her job, her reputation, even the man she left me for. But I hadn't lost anything of real value. I still had my integrity, my strength, my sense of who I was, and now I had something even more important, the freedom to start over, without the weight of the past dragging me down. One evening as I was sitting on my balcony, sipping a glass of whiskey and watching the sunset over the bay, I realized that I had finally reached the point I'd been aiming for all along. Not revenge, not vindication, just peace. And that's the funny thing about peace. It doesn't come from destroying someone else. It comes from rebuilding yourself. It comes from letting go of the anger, the hurt, and the need to prove anything to anyone. Karen was gone from my life, and I was better for it. But more importantly, I was free. Free to live my life on my own terms, without the baggage of the past weighing me down. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, I smiled to myself, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I didn't know what the future held for me, but for the first time in years, I was excited to find out. And that, I realized, was the real victory.